A lot of news coming out of Syria when you first heard and saw what was happening. Kind of what went through your mind?
It came very suddenly. People have been fighting the Assad regime for decades, and the civil war has been in a somewhat frozen state since around 2020. So when I saw that the rebel offensive had begun over the past week and a half, I thought, I mean, I've spoken with Syrians and they were excited but cautious because they've been fighting for a very long time. I didn't expect for it to be so sudden. I didn't expect for suddenly to get text messages and reports that Assad has fled Damascus and the regime has fallen. I was very surprised and a little bit tentative in my reaction at first because I just wasn't sure what the circumstances were. And the more that I learned and the more I heard of Syrians' excitement at finally being free from this brutal dynastic dictatorship, the more excited I became for them.
And you mentioned this has been a long time waiting for a lot of the people that live there that have become refugees. Uh, but was was this time any different? Did they do anything different this time around, or why it was so sudden, maybe compared to the previous times?
My read of the situation as a political scientist, maybe it's an occupational hazard to look at things through the geopolitical lens, but when the Civil War began, Russia was not bogged down in a war in Ukraine. Iran was not bogged down through its proxies in Israel through Hezbollah and Hamas. So Assad's primary backers of Russia and Iran had more resources to give at that time. Now the situation has shifted a bit. The strategic priorities for each of those backers has shifted. And so they didn't, I think that the Assad government did not have the backing and the resources that it had had in previous years, and that sort of cut the legs out from under them a bit.
And so, how might the fall of the Assad government impact Syrian refugees here, the people that are currently in Syria?
There has been almost universal, uniform elation and excitement in among Syrians in Sacramento in the United States and in Syria. You may have seen footage from Saydnia prison, one of the most notorious prisons in Syria, being liberated and people being released who had spent years, even decades there. There are toddlers in that prison who were born there and had never left. There are people celebrating the downfall of a regime that has been responsible for some of the most brutal, torturous, repressive tactics anyone has seen in the region. Syria's mukhabarat has been notorious and feared for a long time. So I think it's entirely natural that we see this kind of excitement, even though Syrians are well aware that what comes next is not guaranteed. We know from history, recent and more distant history, that when a dictatorship falls, what comes next is not always democracy. It really is up to Syrians right now to determine what happens next. And in the past, Syria's fate and the self-determination of Syrians have been derailed by external intervention. And I think Syrians now, here and in Syria, know that now is a time for happiness, a time for excitement, but also that it's precarious. And so I think we should support the excitement and the joy, perhaps, while also deferring to Syrians on how they are going to proceed from here. I don't know if you saw, but there was footage from Sacramento, from Syrians here in Sacramento. There's a local cafe owned by a Syrian woman. There were cars, maybe 10 or 15 cars, maybe more, and maybe a dozen or two people. The cars were driving in circles around the parking lot and honking their horns in celebration. And the people who were in the parking lot were waving Syrian flags, the ones with 3 stars, not two. And they were dancing and singing in their joy. So, in terms of the impact on Syrians here and abroad, Syrians are celebrating. I just saw reports and photographs of Syrians leaving the places that they have been living that they were displaced to. More than half of Syria's population of over 20 million people, as its pre-war population, more than half have been displaced in the course of this war, either internally or externally. There are lines of huge lines of cars of Syrians returning to their homes just one day after the fall of the Assad regime. These are people who've been waiting to go home for a very long time. So I guess that's a long-winded way to answer your question. The impact on Syrians in Syria and abroad is tremendous. Um, Certainly not every Syrian feels the same way. No population in the world would all feel the same way, but by and large, we have a lot of celebration happening.
And as you mentioned, there's excitement, but there's also sort of being optimistically cautious about
Yes.
what comes next. And you answered a little bit of my question, but I think the most recent example we saw was uh, Afghanistan, where
Hmm.
when America left, it created that vacuum, brought in another rebel, well, not a rebel group, but another group, and then they went the other
Sure.
way.
Yeah.
How can the people of Syria make sure they can really take this back and create a government that they want?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. If I knew the answer to that, I would be maybe in a more powerful position than an associate professor of political science. We have many examples of uh, governments that fall. In the case of Afghanistan, the US military pulled out, which was a little bit different, but um, there are parallels with Iran in the Revolution of 79 when a dynastic regime fell after years and years, decades of struggle. And then what came next was not the democracy that people had envisioned. So in terms of what people can do, I think the Syrian revolutionaries in 2011 learned a lot from the uprisings and the repression that had happened in the countries in the region among their neighbors. They had learned a lot about how to respond to the violent and repressive tactics of the government in the attempt to quell protests. So I have a lot of faith in Syrians that they have learned and continue to learn from the experiences of not only themselves, they have a very rich tradition of protest and struggle for liberation themselves, but also to synthesize the information from the experiences of people around them. My faith in Syrians is unshakable, but I know that there are many groups within Syria right now who are struggling for primacy, who want to end up on the top of this hierarchy at the end of this. Some of those groups are Islamist groups who are backed by various foreign governments, and uh, if they take over, then most likely Syrians will not get the democracy that they want right now. There are other groups that are secular nationalist groups, also backed by um, some of them backed by external powers, and many of them organic, homegrown nationalists, national liberation groups. So it's impossible to say what should be done exactly. There's not a roadmap or a blueprint. It's also very difficult to predict what's going to happen. But right now is a vulnerable time for Syria and Syrians, and I think it's also a time of great hope and great promise.